If you are familiar at all with the hobby of sports magazines collecting, you know that the common conception is that Sports Illustrated newsstand copies that were bought directly from the store are exponentially more rare than subscription copies that had a mailing label attached. But how do we actually know how many newsstands were truly printed and how many are still in existence today? Stick around, I'm going to give you some facts to answer both of those questions. Okay, so it has commonly been stated for several years by multiple people in the hobby that in its heyday, even though Sports Illustrated produced millions of subscription copies of their magazine, only 3 to 5% of the print run consisted of newsstand copies. But where's that info coming from? Is it verifiable? What's the source? The Franchise is a book that was written by Michael McCambridge and published in 1997, detailing a thorough history of the Sports Illustrated magazine. McCambridge interviewed dozens of SI employees over the years to compile an absolutely extraordinary account of everything related to Sports Illustrated. In this tremendous book, McCambridge shares some very important numbers that help shed some actual light for SI collectors. In 1977, McCambridge specifically shares that Sports Illustrated had a circulation of 2.1 million subscribers and averaged approximately 79,000 newsstand sales each week. So from this data, we as collectors can develop a pretty solid idea of just how rare the newsstand copies actually are. 79,000 copies out of 2.1 million is 3.7%, meaning that everything we've been told about the rarity of newsstands is true. Now, the biggest issue that came out in 1977 was Larry Bird's first cover. So based on this data, we can confidently assume that around 79,000 newsstand copies were initially printed of Larry Legend's first cover. McCambridge also shared that in 1956, Sports Illustrated had 600,000 subscribers. This was, of course, the year that Mickey Mantle's first cover was released. So following the guideline of 3.7%, we can assume that only about 22,000 newsstand copies of Mickey Mantle's first cover were printed in 1956. Now, by the 80s, SI had climbed to over 3 million subscribers. Once again, using the same metrics, this would allow us to assume that approximately 111,000 newsstand copies were printed of Michael Jordan's first Sports Illustrated cover. So the 3.7% number is excellent information for us collectors to use as a baseline estimate for how many newsstands were printed. But now, how many newsstands are actually still surviving? After all, magazines are largely viewed as disposable. How many magazines have been in your home over the years, and how many of them did you pitch in the trash? So I searched for statistics on what percentage of magazines are typically thrown away, but unfortunately I came up empty. I've always kind of estimated that only around 10 to 20% of magazines were actually kept. So for the purposes of our calculation, we're going to go with the conservative estimate of 20%. This feels reasonable to conclude that out of every 10 magazines purchased, only 2 were actually saved. So that leaves us with 20% of magazines that are not pitched and may somehow survive in some shape or form. Now, I do feel like there's one more factor that we really need to take into account, and that's time. Some of these Sports Illustrated issues are 50 or 60 years old. So I've come up with a pretty good estimate of how many of those were originally kept, but we need to consider attrition from over the years. Now for this part, I am 100% making my own guess, but I'm going to calculate that an additional 20% of the surviving copies are lost over each decade of their life. So once again, that's basically saying that out of every 10 magazines kept, 2 of them are lost over the course of every 10 years. So for example, let's just say we have an issue that came out exactly 60 years ago today in 1963, and let's just take an easy number of 10,000. If 10,000 copies of that magazine were kept, then by 1973, I would estimate that number to be down 20% to about 8,000. And by 1983, we'd take off another 20%, which would put the number at 6,400, and so on. All right, so that's a lot of numbers, but now we've got these formulas. Let's look at some actual estimates of the real Sports Illustrated magazines that we care about. I mentioned that the 1956 Mickey Mantle first cover had approximately 22,000 newsstand copies printed based on the 3.7% newsstand rule and a total of 600,000 subscribers in 1956. Now, when we take our estimate that only 20% survived, plus add the attrition rate over the past 67 years, that would suggest that there are only an approximate number of 959 newsstand copies of Mickey Mantle's first Sports Illustrated cover out there still in the world today. And honestly, when we look at the CGC census and see that there have currently only been 60 newsstand copies graded, these estimates actually feel pretty realistic. There's a very strong chance that there are still around 900 ungraded newsstand copies of Mickey Mantle's first cover out there in the wild waiting to be discovered. Looking at the Larry Bird first cover from 1977, we had 2.1 million subscribers. There were approximately 79,000 newsstands printed. If only 20% survived, that brings us down to 15,800. Add in the attrition rate for the past 46 years, and we're now looking at approximately 5,500 newsstands that could still be surviving. And so far, only 40 newsstand copies have been graded by CGC. And lastly, let's make an estimate on Michael Jordan's first pro cover from 1984. 3 million subscribers, 3.7% newsstands would suggest a total of 111,000. A survival rate of 20% brings us down to 22,200 copies. And add in attrition from the last 40 years, we're now looking at around 9,000 surviving newsstand copies. Too many numbers, but seriously, this is some good real data to work with to give us an actual estimation of how many newsstands are really out there. And obviously, these estimates are nothing more than that. Estimates. If I were to be completely honest, I actually think the final numbers that spit out from this formula are still a little bit conservative. I think the print run numbers are pretty close, but I think the survival rate is probably even lower than what I've estimated in these numbers. And regardless how you feel about those estimates, you've also got to think about how the grading of CGC adds in yet another layer of rarity. For example, of those approximately 950 surviving Mickey Mantle first covers, how many are in excellent shape and how many would grade 9.0 or higher? Probably very, very few. So here are my 3 takeaways that I hope that you get from this video. Number 1, we can feel pretty good about the estimate that only 3.7% of weekly Sports Illustrateds were newsstands. Number 2, due to the disposability of magazines and survivability over time, the vintage newsstand copies are indeed highly rare, as we have often said. And number 3, there are still plenty of newsstand copies out there just waiting to be found. So happy hunting.